Imagine you are standing at the edge of a mountain just before sunrise. It is cool. The air has that particular stillness that comes only in the last hour of the night, when the world has not yet decided to wake. There is no wind. There is no sound except, somewhere far below you, the faint and constant voice of water moving over stone, and in front of you, filling the whole valley from one ridge to the other, there is a soft blue haze. It pools in the low ground. It drifts up the slopes. It moves so slowly that you're not even sure it is moving at all, until you look away for a moment and look back and find that it has quietly shifted. It looks like smoke. It looks like something is burning somewhere down there beneath the trees, some slow, patient fire that the mountain cannot quite put out and has stopped trying to. These are the great Smoky Mountains. They lie along the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, folded into the long spine of the Appalachians, and more people come here every single year than to any other national park in the country. They come for the views you're looking at right now. They come for the black bears that move through the fog before dawn. They come for the wildflowers and the old forest and the quiet. And almost none of them, walking those trails in the morning light, ever stop to ask the one question that the people who lived here longest spent thousands of years answering in their own way. What is underneath? Not underneath in the ordinary sense. We know what is underneath in the ordinary sense. Rock, root, water, no. The people who knew these mountains best, who knew them not from a trail map but from the inside, who walked them for longer than most of the famous civilizations of the ancient world even existed, said something about this place that we've spent the better part of 2 centuries deciding not to take seriously. They said that beneath these mountains, in the dark and the deep, there was another world, a people, a place, something old and aware and still there, and tonight, slowly, in the calm of an hour exactly like this one, I want to take that claim apart with you, gently, carefully, not to sell you a fantasy, and not to laugh it away either, because both of those are a kind of laziness. I want to do the harder and far more interesting thing. I want to ask, honestly, what is truly underneath these mountains? What is real? What is genuinely unknown, even now, even to the scientists, and why the question itself has been quietly pushed to the very edge of the record for so long that most people have never even heard it asked. Because here is what I have come to believe, after following this for a long time. The answer is stranger than the legend. The truth beneath these mountains is more unsettling and more beautiful than any story about hidden tunnels could ever be. But to get to it, we have to be willing to sit in the not knowing for a while. We have to let the question stay open. So before we go down into the dark together, I want to do something small and I think rather lovely. Wherever you are right now, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Some of you are lying awake in a city that never fully goes silent. The sound of traffic rising and falling like a tide you stopped hearing years ago. Some of you are in a still house at the edge of a sleeping town, with nothing outside the window but ordinary darkness and the occasional far-off dog. Some of you are somewhere I would never guess. Different corners of the same slowly turning planet, all of us awake or drifting off together. I like knowing you are out there. It makes the dark feel less like an empty room and more like a shared one. So tell me, and then let your eyes rest, and let your breathing slow, and let me do the rest. Now, let us go to the mountain. And let us start as the people who lived here started with its name. The Cherokee, whose ancestors lived in and around these mountains for thousands of years before any European ever laid eyes on them, had a name for this place. In English, it is usually given as the place of blue smoke. You can still hear the old word for it spoken today by their descendants, who never left. And here is the first quiet thing worth knowing, the kind of fact that seems small and turns out to be a doorway. The smoke is real. You're looking at it right now, pooling in the valley below you. But it is not smoke in the way you have always assumed. The blue haze that hangs over these ridges on almost every still morning is not made of fire at all. It is made of the forest itself. The countless trees and plants that blanket these slopes are constantly releasing tiny amounts of natural oils and vapours into the air, a soft, invisible exhale of the living forest, breathing out as it has breathed for 10,000 years. And those vapours do something to the light. They scatter it. They catch the short blue wavelengths and throw them gently back at your eye, so that the whole distance turns the colour of deep water. The mountain is not burning. The mountain is breathing. And the smoke you see is the visible shape of that breath. The Cherokee knew this, not in the language of chemistry, but in the deeper sense that matters. They knew the difference between the haze of an evaporating forest and the smoke of a true fire better than anyone who has come since, because they lived inside this weather. They were born into it, and they died into it. They read these slopes and this sky the way you read the face of someone you have loved your entire life, catching the meaning of the smallest change before you could explain how you knew. And yet, knowing all of that, knowing the haze was only the forest breathing, they still said the mountain breathed in another way too, a second breath, deeper than the first, through openings in the rock, through certain places known and remembered and pointed to, where the air moved when the air had no reason to move, where the warmth coming up out of the ground was wrong for the season, where the sound that rose from below was not the sound of wind in the leaves, but something lower and slower and far harder to name. Now, I want to be careful with you, right here at the beginning, because how we handle this moment decides whether the rest of the night is honest or not. It would be easy to take those descriptions and run straight into fantasy, to say, there you see secret passages, hidden chambers, a buried world. And it would be just as easy to do the opposite, to wave the whole thing away as superstition, the charming imaginings of a people who did not understand geology. Both of those are the lazy move. Both of them stop the question instead of following it. Because the Cherokee did not tell these things as bedtime nonsense. They told them as knowledge, as a kind of map. Not a map drawn on paper, but a map carried in words, in story, in carefully chosen language passed from an elder to a child, and from that child, decades later, to another. And that distinction is not a small one. It is, in fact, the hinge that this entire night turns on. Because when a culture folds real, practical information about a landscape into its stories, that information can survive for an astonishingly long time. Far longer than you would think. Far longer than most written records last. Researchers studying the oral traditions of Aboriginal peoples in Australia have argued that some of those traditions appear to preserve accurate memories of coastlines as they existed many thousands of years ago before the seas rose at the end of the last ice age and swallowed the old shore. Stories of land where there is now only water, of islands that were once hills you could walk to, memories carried by mouth alone across a span of time longer than the entire written history of most of the nations on Earth. Not as poetry, as geography, as a true account of a coastline that no living person had seen, because the last person who saw it had died 100 generations before. If that is possible, and serious researchers believe it may be, then we owe the Cherokee the same courtesy. When they said, again and again, across the long centuries that there was something beneath these mountains, and when they described it not vaguely but with a strange and stubborn specificity that deserves more than a polite smile and a change of subject, it deserves the question asked seriously, what were they describing? And to get anywhere near an answer, we first have to meet them, the ones who were said to live down there in the dark. Because in the Cherokee telling, the world beneath the mountain was not empty. It was inhabited, and the inhabitants had a name. In the traditions of the Cherokee there is a people called the Nunahi. The name is usually translated as the people who live anywhere, or sometimes simply the travelers, and we know about them, in writing in careful detail, largely because of one man and the work he did at exactly the right moment, just before so much of it might have slipped away forever. In the late 1800s, an ethnographer named James Mooney came into these mountains and stayed. He worked with the Eastern Cherokee, the ones who had remained in North Carolina, and he did the thing that almost no one in his era thought to do. He listened for years. He learned the language. He sat with the elders and the storytellers and the keepers of tradition, and he wrote down everything they were willing to share with him. The histories, the medicine, the sacred formulas, and the stories, before the pressures of a changing and often brutal age could scatter them. His great collection of Cherokee myths, published by the National Bureau that studies such things at the turn of the century, remains to this day one of the most important records of Cherokee knowledge in existence. And the Nunahi are in it, described with care. So when I tell you about them, understand that I am not handing you folklore I found in some dark corner of the internet. I am handing you something that real Cherokee people told to a serious listener more than 100 years ago, because they wanted it remembered. And the first thing to understand about the Nunahi is what they are not. They are not ghosts. This is the detail that the careless versions always get wrong. In the Cherokee telling, they are not pale spirits drifting on some separate spiritual plane, untouchable, unreal. They are a people, solid, living, able to speak with human beings, to feast with them, to fight beside them, to take them by the hand. But they are not quite like ordinary humans either, and the difference is the whole point. They are said to be immortal. They do not age and they do not die, and they live, for the most part, out of sight, in great townhouses beneath the surface of the world, under the mountains, under the rivers, under the still, deep, dark water of the mountain pools, where the light gives out a few feet down, and everything below is unknown. In the stories, they are good to the Cherokee. They are not feared. They are, if anything, loved, the way you love something powerful that has chosen to be kind to you. They appear in times of trouble. There are accounts of them taking in travellers who are lost in the high country, sheltering them through the night in a warm and lighted townhouse inside the mountain, feeding them and sending them home at dawn, only for the traveller to turn back and find nothing there at all, only the bare rock and the mist. There are accounts of them caring for the sick, and in the oldest and most striking tellings, there are accounts of them coming to the aid of the Cherokee in war. I will tell you one of those stories in a moment, because it is tied to a real place that you could drive to tomorrow, a place that still exists. But first I want you to simply sit with the image, here in the dark, the way the Cherokee sat with it for 1,000 years and more. A people who live beneath the mountain, who are always there, just below the surface of the world you can see, who do not die, who come up quietly when they are needed, and who go back down into the warm and lighted hollow places when the need has passed. It is, when you let it settle, an extraordinarily comforting idea, and also an unsettling one. because it means you are never in this telling truly alone in the wilderness. The mountain is occupied. The dark below your feet is somebody's home. Now, the modern mind wants badly to do one of two things with a tradition like this. It wants to either dismiss it instantly, the way the 19th century dismissed almost everything it had not built with its own hands, or it wants to seize it as proof, to shout that here, at last, is evidence of a literal hidden civilization, a secret tunnel empire, and then to go looking for documents that do not exist and invent them where they are missing, just to fill the silence. I am going to do neither of those things tonight. I want to say that plainly, and I want you to hold me to it. Both of those moves are a kind of disrespect, just pointed in opposite directions. One disrespects the Cherokee by treating their deepest traditions as childish. The other disrespects the truth by dressing fantasy up as fact. What I want to do instead is the patient thing. I want to hold the question open, carefully, the way you would cup something in your hands that you found in the dark and cannot yet see. The Nunahi are real, as a tradition. That much is beyond dispute. Mooney did not invent them. The Cherokee told them to him as something that mattered, something true in the way that mattered to them. The question that almost no one has been willing to sit with honestly, the question I want us to carry all the way through this long night, is the quieter and far more difficult one. What real thing, if anything, sits underneath the story? What, in this actual landscape, this actual rock, this actual buried history, gave a people reason to say, over and over, across uncountable generations, with such calm conviction, that there was a world beneath the mountain? To even begin to answer that, we're going to have to do something the legend never does. We're going to have to go down into the rock itself and ask what it is truly made of. We're going to have to look at what the people of this continent actually built, above the ground and below it, and at the long, deliberate effort that was made to convince everyone that they had built nothing at all. And we're going to have to follow a seam of something that shines down into the dark, where we can prove, beyond any doubt, that human hands were once at work. But before any of that, let me keep my promise. Let me tell you the story of the place where the immortals came out of the mountain, because it is real ground, and you can still stand on it. There is a place in western North Carolina, in the valley of a river the Cherokee knew long before anyone else did, where a mound of earth still rises beside the water. People raised it by hand a very long time ago. It is not large as these things go, but it is old, and it was sacred, and around it once stood one of the principal towns of the Cherokee people. And the Cherokee said that beneath this mound lived the Nunahi. In the story that Mooney recorded, the immortals had their townhouse inside that very mound, and they were known to the people of the town above. They were neighbours, in a sense, unseen, but present. And the story tells of a day when an enemy came, a war party from another nation, moving against the town, far stronger than the warriors who were there to defend it. The people knew they could not win. They prepared, as people do, to fight and to lose. And then the Nunahi came up out of the mound. In the telling, they rose from beneath the earth in great numbers, a host of warriors who had not been there a moment before, and they fell upon the enemy and drove them back, and the town was saved. And when the fighting was over, they went back down into the mound, into the dark, into the townhouse beneath the world, and the surface closed over them again as though they had never been. The people of the town went on living their lives above the heads of their immortal protectors, and the river went on running, and the mound sat quiet in the sun. There is more than one such story attached to more than one such place. In some tellings, When a town was in its final extremity, the Nunnehi did not come up to fight, but instead took the whole town in, lifted it, people and townhouse and all, down into the mountain or under the river, to live with the immortals forever, safe from everything that was coming. There are places in these mountains that the Cherokee said were exactly that, the site of a town that had not been destroyed, but rather saved by being taken below, now. I'm going to stop and be very honest with you because this is one of those moments that decides everything. I cannot tell you that an army of immortal beings literally rose out of a mound and won a battle. I do not believe that, and I will not pretend to you that I do, and I will not twist the evidence to make it sound as if some scientist somewhere confirmed it. That is exactly the dishonesty this whole channel exists to avoid. But watch what is actually happening in this story, because it is far more interesting than a simple yes or no. The mound is real. You can stand on it. The town was real. The river is real and still runs. The people were real, and their descendants are alive today. And the story is doing something very specific with all of that real material. It is saying, in the language of the sacred, that this ground is not what it appears to be, that beneath the visible town there is another town, that beneath the world you can defend with warriors there is a world defended by something that cannot be defeated, that the land itself, the actual earth of this actual valley, is on the side of the people who belong to it, and will rise up out of itself to protect them when everything else has failed. Hold that thought, because we're going to need it later, near the end, when we come to what actually happened to these people. The idea of a protector inside the mountain, an immortal town beneath the surface that no enemy can reach, is going to mean something very different and very heavy once you know what was done to the Cherokee in the century after these stories were told. A people facing the end of their world told stories about a town that could not be destroyed because it had been hidden beneath the earth. Sit with why a people might need a story like that. We will come back to it, I promise. For now, simply notice this. The Nunnehi tradition is not floating free of the real landscape. It is pinned to it, to specific mounds, to specific rivers, to specific pools and ridges and named places. The immortals do not live in some far-off heaven. They live here, under this, beneath ground you can touch. And that pinning, that insistence on real geography, is the thread we're going to follow all the way down. There is one more layer to this, and it is worth a moment, because people often confuse it. Alongside the Nunnehi, the Cherokee also told of another kind of being, the little people, small, of human shape, living in the rock cliffs and the laurel thickets and the caves, helpful most of the time, fond of children, but easily offended and best left alone if you came upon their things in the woods. They're not the same as the Nunnehi. Though both are people of the hidden places, both belong to the parts of the world that ordinary daylight does not reach. The Cherokee landscape, you have to understand, was full, crowded almost. Above the ground, the people. Below it and within it and behind it, the immortals, the little people, the spirits of the animals, an entire population that shared the same mountains and the same waters. To walk through this country, in the old understanding, was never to walk alone. It was to move, politely and carefully, through somebody else's inhabited home. That is the world we have to keep in mind, because we're about to leave the stories for a while and go into the cold facts of the rock, the science, the geology. And the science is going to tell us something that seems, at first, to shut the whole question down. It is going to tell us that these mountains do not make the kind of caves the legend seems to need, but stay with me. because that inconvenient fact, properly understood, does not close the door at all. It opens a much stranger one. Here is a fact that quietly undoes the simplest version of this entire story, and I'm going to tell it to you first, before anything else, precisely because it is inconvenient. Because the honest version of a mystery, the version that survives daylight, is always stronger than the convenient one that falls apart the moment you press on it. The Great Smoky Mountains are not the kind of mountains that make great caves. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how most of the world's famous underground places came to exist. When you picture a cave, a real cave, with vast halls and hanging stone and rivers running through the dark, you're almost certainly picturing limestone. Limestone is a soft rock, and more importantly, it is a soluble one. Rainwater, made very slightly acidic as it passes through the soil, seeps down into the limestone and, with infinite patience, over hundreds of thousands of years dissolves it. Grain by grain it carries the rock away in solution, and what it leaves behind is empty space. A cave. Given enough time, an entire underground landscape of them, linked into systems that run for miles. That is how the great ones formed. A few hundred miles to the northwest of where you're standing in Kentucky lies the longest cave system known anywhere on Earth. More than 400 miles of mapped passages winding through limestone and still being mapped, the end of it not yet found. Just to the east, in the valleys of Virginia, the famous show caverns draw their hundreds of thousands of visitors a year into halls of dissolved stone, soft rock, patient water, vast, hollow, breathing dark. But the Smokies are not made of that, and this is the crucial point, the one that almost every dramatic telling of this story conveniently skips. The core of these mountains is metamorphic rock. To picture what that means, go back in your mind an almost unimaginable distance into the past. Picture ancient sediments, sands and muds, laid down on the floor of a vanished sea something like 500 million years ago, and more. Then picture all of that buried mile upon mile deep and crushed under the weight, and cooked by the heat of the earth, and folded and pressed until the soft sediment became something else entirely. Hard, dense, changed at the level of its crystals. This is some of the oldest exposed rock in all of eastern North America, and it has been through more than almost any stone you will ever touch. And water does not carve open holes in rock like that. It cannot dissolve it the way it dissolves limestone, because there is nothing there to dissolve in the same easy way. Instead, the water threads its way along cracks, along fractures, along the thin seams and joints where the rock has split. It moves through these mountains in narrow lines, not open rooms. So the simplest fantasy, the one the most sensational versions of this story are selling, a great natural network of open tunnels running clean and walkable through the heart of the range, a hidden highway beneath the peaks, is not what this geology produces. There is no documented system like that here, and I am not going to invent one for you. There are small caves, here and there, where occasional thin bands of softer rock, lenses of marble caught within the harder stone, have dissolved out over the ages. There are fractures and tight crawlways and the modest hollows that any mountain holds. But a vast underground empire beneath the Smokies, of the kind the legends seem to promise, is not something the science supports, and an honest guide has to tell you so. And now here is the turn, the thing that makes this fact a door instead of a wall. That inconvenient geology makes the Cherokee tradition more interesting, not less. Think about it. If these mountains were riddled with obvious gaping limestone caves, then a story about an underground world would be the most ordinary thing imaginable. Every limestone region on the planet has such stories, because every limestone region has the caves to seed them. The underworld rights itself when the ground is already hollow. There would be nothing to explain. But the Smokies are not generous with hollow places. The rock holds itself shut. It is some of the most stubbornly solid stone in the country. And yet the people who lived here longest, who knew this rock more intimately than any geologist ever will, still spoke, insistently, specifically and for a very long time, of a world beneath the mountain, of warm air coming up out of openings in the season when it should have been cold, of places where the earth was not solid but somehow hollow. So we are left with a real puzzle, and it is a good one, the kind worth turning over slowly in the dark. Either those people meant something we're not yet understanding, or they were describing something genuinely real, something physical that we've simply never properly looked for in a landscape that the science says should not hold it. Or the underground, in their telling, was never only about literal stone in the first place, but about something larger, something the rock was only the outermost layer of. To work out which, we have to leave the mountain for a while. We have to leave the rock and the stories both, and confront the single largest reason that questions like this one were buried so deep that most people have never even heard them. And it is not a story about geology at all. It is a story about a lie, a deliberate one, told carefully for a very long time, to a very great many people, and told for a reason so clear and so cold that once you see it, you will not be able to look at any of this the same way again. For most of the 1800s, the educated people of this country, the scientists, the writers, the politicians, the men who decided what everyone else would believe, told themselves a story about the land they were in the process of taking. And the story was this: the people who already lived on it had never built anything that mattered. Now that should have been an impossible thing to believe, because the evidence against it was lying in plain sight, all over the eastern half of the continent. Earthworks, thousands of them, enormous mounds of raised earth, some of them the size of small hills, shaped with clear intention. Vast geometric enclosures, perfect circles and precise squares of piled soil, so large that you could set an entire village down inside one and have room to spare. Walls of earth that ran for miles. These were not natural features. No one who looked at them honestly could think so. They had been built by hand, basket of soil by basket of soil, by enormous numbers of people working together with planning and skill across generations. You could not miss them. The settlers ploughed around them and through them. The roads bent to avoid them. They were simply there, in the landscape, undeniable. And so the educated men of the 19th century, faced with this overwhelming evidence of a sophisticated civilization, did something that should astonish us more than it does. Rather than accept the obvious conclusion that the ancestors of the people living right there had built these things, they invented an answer to avoid it. They said the mounds has been built by someone else, by a lost race, a vanished, gifted, superior people who had come to this continent long ago, raised all of these great works, and then mysteriously died out or moved on, leaving the empty land to be inherited by lesser peoples who had nothing to do with the marvels around them. And who was this lost race? Take your pick, because they tried them all. Perhaps it was the Vikings, perhaps a lost tribe of Israel, wandered impossibly far from home, perhaps a Welsh prince and his followers, perhaps refugees from a drowned Atlantis, perhaps ancient Egyptians or Phoenicians or some nameless white civilization swallowed by time. Anyone at all, so long as the answer was not the simple and obvious truth standing directly in front of them. The lost race could be anybody, on one condition: They could not be the native peoples of this land. I need you to understand that this was not a harmless academic quirk. This was not merely sloppy thinking that did no damage. This was a lie with a purpose, and the purpose was as practical as a deed of sale. Because the lie answered a question that the young and hungry nation very badly needed answered. If the people already on this land had built nothing, organized nothing, truly made nothing of the place, then in a deep sense they were not really inhabiting it at all. They were merely wandering across the surface of it, like deer, like weather. And land that is only wandered across, the reasoning went, is not truly owned. It is empty. It is unimproved. It is, by the logic of the men who wanted it, available, free for the taking by those who would finally build upon it and make it mean something. The lie about who built the mounds was the quiet engine underneath the taking of an entire continent. Read that again, slowly, in the dark. It turned a theft into a discovery. It turned a conquest into a homecoming. It turned an inheritance stolen into an empty page that the new arrivals could tell themselves they were the first to write upon. The myth of the empty land was not a misunderstanding. It was a tool, and it worked. The truth did come out eventually, and the most fitting thing about it is that it came out from inside the establishment itself, dragged into the light by a man who'd expected to find the opposite. Late in the 1800s, a careful investigator named Cyrus Thomas was given the task, by the government's own Bureau of Ethnology, of settling the mound builder question once and for all. By his own account, he began the work more or less expecting to confirm the lost race. He was a man of his time, but he was also honest, and he did the actual work, the digging, the measuring, the patient comparison. And the more he uncovered, the more undeniable the truth became. The mounds had been built by the ancestors of the native peoples who were still at that very moment being driven off the land. There was no vanished superior civilization. There never had been. The builders had been here the whole time. They were here still. They were the people everyone had agreed to pretend had built nothing. His report near the close of the century settled the scientific question. In the textbooks, the lost race finally died, as it should have, having never lived. But here is the part that matters for our long night, the part that explains why we are even able to have this conversation about forgotten things beneath these mountains. The lie died, but the habit of mind it had trained did not die with it. The reflex outlived the claim, that deep, trained, almost invisible instinct to look at this land and assume that nothing complex had ever happened here. To assume that whatever was impressive must have an explanation from somewhere else. To treat the people who had lived here longest as a simple footnote to the landscape, rather than as its authors, its engineers, its long and sophisticated inhabitants. That instinct lingered in the halls of science for generations after Cyrus Thomas. It shaped quietly which questions felt worth asking and which felt faintly embarrassing. It shaped which sites got the careful excavation and which got the dismissive footnote. And a question like the one we're asking tonight, the question of what the Cherokee meant when they spoke, with such specificity, of an inhabited world beneath their mountains, is precisely the kind of question that instinct buries without anyone ever deciding to bury it. It simply falls into the gap between what we expect and what we're willing to take seriously, and there it sits. So before we go back to the mountain, I want to do the thing the 19th century refused to do. I want to look squarely at what these supposedly simple people actually built, not the legend, the proven, excavated, measured, undeniable fact of it, because it is the most direct answer there is to the lie, and it is so staggering that once you've seen it, the idea of an underground world stops sounding like a fantasy and starts sounding like exactly the kind of thing these people were entirely capable of. Let me take you to a city, a real one, larger at its height than London. Let me take you for a little while away from the Smokies west to a low grassy rise in the flat country of southern Illinois. It is night. Across the dark river to the west you can see the faint electric glow of the modern city of St. Louis, smudging the underside of the clouds. The air is warm and damp, the grass is wet against your legs, and under your feet, though you would never once guess it from the quiet ordinary darkness all around you, is the largest earthwork ever raised by human hands anywhere in the Americas. It is a great pyramid of earth, not stone, earth. It rises in broad, flat terraces, level upon level, and at its base it covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Stop and let that comparison land, because we are not taught to let it land. More ground than the Great Pyramid. And it was built without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals to haul the loads. To raise it, people carried earth, basket by woven basket on their own backs, up the growing slope and emptied it, and turned around and went back down for more. Millions upon millions of basket loads over decades, held to a single design, across more than one human lifetime. And it did not stand alone. This was the heart of a city. Around this great mound once spread more than 100 others, of every size, arranged with care around enormous open plazas. There were neighbourhoods. There were thousands of homes. There was a great wall of timber enclosing the centre, a wall that swallowed something like 20,000 whole trees. There were marketplaces and workshops and the houses of the powerful. There was an economy with specialists, people who made their living by their particular skill, which is one of the truest marks of a real city anywhere on earth. And there was astronomy, great rings of upright posts set in the ground to track the sun across its yearly journey, so that the people would know the turning of the seasons. At its height, around the year 1100, this place may have held 10 to 20,000 people living together in one settlement. To grasp what that means, hold it against the old world at the very same moment. In that same century, this city on the Mississippi was larger than London. People were living here, in a planned metropolis at the meeting of the great rivers, in greater numbers than were living in the city that would one day rule a quarter of the globe. We call it Cahokia. And here is the quiet shock, the one I felt the first time I truly understood it. Almost no one raised in this country was ever told that it existed. Think about that. If this city, these mounds, this metropolis larger than London stood in Egypt, or in the river valleys of the Old World, or anywhere across the ocean, you would have learned its name as a small child. There would be famous photographs of it. There would be films and documentaries, and crowds of visitors come from the far side of the world to walk among its mounds and feel the age of the place. It would be one of the wonders everyone knows. But because it stands here, in the middle of this continent, it was studied quietly by a handful of specialists, mentioned in a paragraph, if at all, and left almost entirely out of the story the country tells itself about where it came from and what was here before. The lie did its work so well that even after the lie was disproven, the forgetting continued on its own momentum. We did not need to be told to ignore Cahokia. We had already been trained not to expect it, and Cahokia, vast as it was not some lonely exception, a single freak flowering in an otherwise empty land. It sat at the centre of a whole world, a continent laced with cities and towns and trade and roads worn smooth by countless feet, with a depth of human history behind it that runs back not for centuries, but for many thousands of years. The people who built Cahokia were the inheritors of a long, long tradition of raising great works out of the earth, a tradition that reaches right back into the country we are concerned with tonight, right back toward these mountains, because hundreds of miles to the east of Cahokia, in the valleys of what is now Ohio, an earlier people had already done something that, in its own way, is even harder to believe than a city of 20,000 souls. They had reached up from the earth and taken hold of the sky. In central Ohio, near a town called Newark, there once stretched one of the most extraordinary things ever built on the North American continent. Most of it is gone now, ploughed flat, built over, quarried away for fill in the very centuries when we were busy telling ourselves that nothing here was worth keeping. But enough survived, two of the great shapes, for us to understand what we lost, and what survived is enough to stop your breath. Picture, across some 4 square miles of green Ohio country, a vast complex of walls made of raised earth. Not defensive walls, geometric ones, great circles, laid out with a precision that is difficult to achieve even now, a perfect square, and an enormous octagon, an 8-sided enclosure so large that you could lose a small town inside it, joined by a long, straight, earthen avenue to a great circle, the whole thing forming a single deliberate design spread across the land, on a scale that is hard to take in even from the air. People raised this around 2,000 years ago. We call them, for lack of their own name, the Hope Well, after the farm where their works were first carefully studied, and for a long time, even after we admitted they had built it, we assumed it was simply ceremonial. Beautiful, but not, intelligent in the way we flatter ourselves to be intelligent. And then, in the 20th century, someone actually measured it against the sky, and the truth came out of the earth. The octagon is aligned to the moon, not roughly, not in some vague poetic way that you could talk yourself into, precisely. Now you have to understand what a strange and difficult thing that is to do, because the moon is not the sun. The sun is, relatively speaking, easy. It runs through its whole cycle in a single year, and any patient people can track where it rises across the seasons. But the moon moves to a far longer and more tangled rhythm. The points on the horizon where the moon rises and sets swing slowly back and forth, and the full cycle, out to the farthest extreme and all the way back, does not take a year. It takes about 18.5 years. Think about what it means to capture that in the ground. You cannot see this cycle in a season. You cannot see it in a year. You cannot even see it in 5 years. To find it, to even know it is there, the people of this valley had to watch the moon, carefully, night after night, marking where it rose along the horizon, across at least one entire cycle of more than 18 years, and almost certainly across several, because a single cycle would not be enough to be sure. They had to remember what they saw, and pass the watching from one generation to the next, holding the thread of the observation steady across decades and across deaths. Then they had to take that knowledge and translate it into geometry, into precise angles and lengths, and then they had to lay that geometry out across thousands of acres of land, in walls of earth, accurately enough that the alignment still holds, measurable and confirmed 2,000 years later. That is not the work of a simple people scratching at the dirt to survive. That is science. Sustained observation across generations. Mathematics. Engineering. Astronomy of a high order, done with earth and memory instead of glass and steel. Carried out, in the Ohio Valley, at a time when only a handful of cultures anywhere on the entire earth could have matched it. And in our own time, at last, the world has formally admitted it. Only a few years ago, these earthworks were placed on the shortlist of humanity's greatest treasures, named alongside the pyramids and the great cathedrals and the wonders of the ancient world. It took until now. It took until our own lifetimes for the official story to finally say out loud what those 8 earthen walls had been quietly saying to the moon for 20 centuries. Now hold all of this together in your mind here in the dark. A city larger than London, an observatory of Earth that tracked the hardest rhythm in the sky. These are not the achievements of people who could not have known their own mountains. These are the achievements of the same broad world, the same deep and ancient human presence on this continent that the Cherokee belonged to. The people who told the stories of the Nunahi were not a people incapable of understanding the land beneath their feet. They were heirs to one of the oldest and most sophisticated traditions of working with earth and stone and sky that the human species has ever produced. The land was not empty. It was never empty. I told you to carry that sentence down into the dark with you, and now you can feel the full weight of it. When a people who came from the world that built Cahokia and measured the moon at Newark turn to you and say, with quiet certainty, that there is an inhabited world beneath their mountains, the honest response is not the smile and the raised eyebrow. The honest response is to lean in and to ask, with real humility, what did you know, thus we do not? And in the Smokies, it turns out there is at least one thing they knew, and did beneath the ground. That is not a story and not a tradition, and not a matter of faith at all. It is solid, proven, excavated fact. It involves following a seam of something that shines down into the dark of the rock, and we can prove, beyond any doubt whatsoever, that it happened. In the rock of these mountains and the mountains close around them, there is a mineral called mica. You have seen it, even if you never knew to give it a name. Mica is the stone that splits. It cleaves into thin, flat, flexible sheets, some of them nearly clear, so that if you peel one away and hold it up to a candle, you can almost see the flame through it, gone soft and golden. It glitters. A face of rock studded with mica catches the light and throws it back at you in 1,000 tiny points, as though someone had crushed a star into the stone. To people long ago, working by firelight and sunlight, with no idea of the chemistry of it, mica must have seemed like something the earth had no right to hold. A piece of solid, frozen light waiting in the dark of the ground, and we know, for an absolute certainty, that the ancient peoples of this continent treasured it. Hundreds of miles to the north, in the ceremonial centres of that same Hopewell world we just visited, in the sacred mounds of Ohio, archaeologists have lifted from the earth objects cut from sheets of mica, and they are breathtaking, shapes of startling care and skill, scissored from single thin sheets of the shining stone. There is one in particular that, once you've seen it, you do not forget. The shape of a human hand, cut from a single sheet of mica, thin and translucent and glittering, the fingers long and slightly spread, almost 2,000 years old. A hand of frozen light, laid into a sacred place by people who are gone. There are birds cut the same way, and claws and serpents, and shapes whose meaning died with the makers, and that we can only stand before and wonder at. These were not idle ornaments. They were placed in the most sacred context those people possessed, with their honoured dead at the centre of their holiest ground. The mica mattered to them at the deepest level there is, and the mica they cut these wonders from came in large part from the southern Appalachians, from this region, from these mountains and the high country around them. The shining stone began its journey here, in the rock beneath the blue smoke, and travelled hundreds of miles to be laid, as a glittering hand, into the dark of an Ohio mound. Now think carefully about what getting that mica actually required. Mica does not lie in convenient heaps on the surface, waiting to be gathered like fallen fruit. It runs in seams, in veins, threaded through the hard body of the rock, and once you have collected whatever loose pieces lie on the surface, the only way to reach more, the only way to feed a trade that carries the shining stone across half a continent for centuries, is to follow the seam, into the rock, down, into the dark. You dig along the shining vein, prying the stubborn stone apart by hand, working deeper and deeper to free the light trapped inside it. This is mining. Real, ancient, underground mining, done by the people of this land long before anyone arrived to declare that they had built nothing. And unlike almost everything else that human beings do, mining leaves a mark that lasts. Songs fade, wooden houses rot, field and garden return to forest within a lifetime. But a hole cut into hard rock can endure for thousands of years. Mining leaves the negative shape of human effort carved permanently into the stone. It leaves pits. It leaves worked faces. It leaves passages. And in the mountains of western North Carolina, those marks were found. When miners came through this region in the 1800s, chasing mica for the new industrial uses the modern world had discovered for it, they made, in more than one place, a discovery that should have been a national story, and instead became a footnote. They found that they were not the first. They found old workings already there in the rock, pits and openings cut into the hard stone following the very same shining seams the new miners were after, but dug long, long before, by hand, by people who had clearly known exactly what they were doing and exactly where the mineral ran, with a skill that the newcomers could only respect. At one well-known site in these mountains, the later miners came to understand that the ground beneath them had been opened in deep antiquity, that someone had been here before, in the dark, following the light in the rock, and had taken the best of it, and had left the silent evidence of their labour cut into the stone for the next people to find 1,000 years on. So here, at last, is the honest, grounded, provable version of the underground story. Not a hidden empire of immortal beings. Something quieter, and in its own way far more moving because it is true. Real human hands a very long time ago, working in the dark beneath these very mountains, following a seam of light down into the rock, freeing it sheet by glittering sheet, carrying it back up into the sun and then out along the trails and the rivers into a network of trade that reached clear across the continent until a piece of these mountains came to rest, shaped into a translucent hand in the heart of a sacred mound 500 miles away. There were people under the mountain. There is no doubt about that at all. None. The only questions left are how far they went, and how deep, and how much of what they did has been lost to us forever, churned away by the logging and the ploughs and the long forgetting. And to feel the true and dizzying weight of that question, of human work done underground on a scale we genuinely cannot measure. Even now, we have to leave the Smokies one more time. We have to travel north, to a cold and enormous lake, and to a genuine mystery, a real one, that no one to this day has ever fully solved. Far to the north of these mountains, on the shores of the greatest of the Great Lakes, there is metal in the ground. Copper. And not in faint traces, not scattered in stingy flecks the way most of the world holds it. Here, in this one stretch of country, copper occurs in a form so unusually pure that you can, with enough patience and enough labour, simply work it free of the surrounding rock and hammer it into shape without ever needing the secret of smelting at all. The earth here offers the metal up almost finished. You only have to take it. When mining companies pushed into this northern country in the 1800s, hungry for that copper, they expected, as the newcomers always expected, to be the first. They were not even close. What they found, scattered across the land and the islands of that cold lake, were pits, thousands of them, ancient workings dug down into the rock, following the richest veins of copper with an accuracy that the modern prospectors, with all their instruments, could only envy. And in those old pits, lying where they'd been set down and never picked up again, were tools, stone hammers by the thousand, heavy hand-held mauls of hard rock, worn smooth and round by uncountable blows. In some places, masses of copper sat half-freed from the stone. The work simply stopped, as though the miners had laid down their tools one ordinary afternoon, meaning to come back the next day, and somehow never had. Some of the loose hammers, it is said, were still piled where their owners had left them, waiting across all the centuries for hands that never returned. This was not a small operation, and it was not a brief one. People mined copper on these shores and these islands for thousands of years. The deepest reaches of it may run back 6,000 or 7,000 years, and perhaps further still, into a past so distant that it makes the entire later history of this country look like a single afternoon. And the metal travelled. Copper from these northern lakes turns up at ancient sites scattered clear across the continent, worked into tools and ornaments and sacred objects by peoples who lived hundreds, even thousands of miles away, who had never seen the lake and perhaps never heard of it, but who held in their hands a piece of its metal, passed along the trade routes from one people to the next across distances that should stagger you. There was a network here, old and vast and sophisticated, moving this metal across a continent long before any European knew the land existed. And now we come to the genuine open question, the honest one, the kind that is worth lying awake over, not because someone is trying to frighten you, but because it is simply, truly unresolved. When people first tried to estimate how much copper had been taken out of those ancient pits over all those thousands of years, some of the numbers that came back were very large enough that people began to ask an uncomfortable question, and they have never entirely stopped asking it. Where did it all go? Because the quantity of ancient worked copper that we actually find in graves and at old sites and in museum drawers did not always seem, to some who looked at it, to match the sheer scale of the digging. There appeared to some eyes to be a gap between how much had been mined and how much we can find, and that gap has never been cleanly and finally closed to everyone's satisfaction. Now, I am going to be very honest with you here, because honesty is the only thing that makes a mystery worth telling, and dishonesty is the thing that turns a real wonder into cheap noise. There are good, ordinary, careful explanations for a great deal of that apparent gap, and an honest person has to put them on the table. Some of those early estimates of how much was removed were almost certainly far too high, produced by people who, frankly, had reasons to want the ancient mines to sound as grand and as mysterious as possible. Much of the copper was surely worked and reworked and traded onward and lost and buried with the dead in graves we have never found and never will, and simply scattered and recycled across thousands of years until the trail went cold. Most of everything that was ever in the ground we have never excavated and never will excavate. The honest scholar can account for much of the supposed mystery with patience and arithmetic and a clear head, but here is the thing. Even when you have allowed for all of that fairly and fully, a soft strangeness remains, a sense of scale that does not entirely settle, a feeling standing at the edge of one of those ancient pits in the cold northern air that something very large happened here, something organized and deliberate and sustained across a span of time that dwarfs the whole history of the nation that came after, and that we still, even now, with all our science, do not fully understand it. We do not know exactly who did all of it. We do not know exactly how they organized so much labor across so many thousands of years. We do not know, with real confidence, exactly where all of that ancient metal finally went. And maybe we never will. And that, if I am being honest with you in the dark, is part of what makes it the very best kind of mystery. It is not a riddle handed to you with a neat little bow, solved and finished and safe. It is an open one, a real one, a genuine hole in the record up in the cold north, where an enormous amount of work was done over an almost unimaginable stretch of time by people we permitted ourselves to forget so completely that we did not even leave room in our story for them to have existed. Hold that question. Where did the copper go? Let it sit, unanswered, the way the best questions do. We may circle back to it somewhere in your dreams tonight. For now, let us come back south, toward the blue smoke, and let us ask the next question, which follows naturally from everything we have seen. If there were people moving copper and mica and 100 other things across this whole continent in an organized way for thousands of years, then how did it move? What held this vast network together? Because a continent laced with trade is not an accident. It is an achievement. And these mountains, our mountains, the ones you are still standing on at the edge of in the dark, were not some forgotten backwater off to the side of all that. They were a knot in the very centre of it. Go back now in your mind to where you were standing at the very beginning of all this. The edge of the mountain, the last hour before dawn, the blue haze pooling in the valley below you, drifting up the slope so slowly you can barely tell it moves, looking for all the world like smoke, like some slow patient fire burning somewhere down there in the dark beneath the trees. You know now what that haze truly is, the breath of the living forest, the soft exhale of 10,000 acres of trees and plants, scattering the light until the distance turns the colour of deep water, not fire, not a sign of anything at all burning beneath the surface, and yet, the people who lived here longest knew that too, knew it better than any of us ever will. And they still said, with all the quiet authority of 1,000 years of knowing this exact ground, that the mountain breathed in another way, that beneath it there was another world. We spent this whole long night learning that they were right. Just not in the way the cheap version of the story wanted them to be. There is a world beneath these mountains. It is not a hollow kingdom of immortals behind a secret door. It is something that should move you far more deeply than that ever could, because it is true, and because it was nearly stolen from all of us. It is the buried, deliberate, almost erased fact of an immense human past. People who built cities larger than London out of earth carried on their own backs. People who watched the moon for 18 years and longer, and then wrote what they had learned into the ground so perfectly that it still holds true 2,000 years on. People who went down into this very rock that does not give up its hollows easily, and followed a seam of frozen light into the dark, and freed it sheet by glittering sheet, and sent it across half a continent to be laid as a shining hand into the heart of a sacred mound. People who held the passes and the crossings of one of the great walls of the continent, people who knew this land so completely, above and below, that they folded the whole of it into stories strong enough to survive a removal, a logging, a deliberate lie, and 2 centuries of being told they had never really been here at all. That is what is beneath the blue smoke. Not a secret. A truth. One we were carefully taught to walk straight past on our way to admire the view. The haze still rises from these ridges every single morning, exactly as it has since long before any of us, and long before this was anyone's nation, and long before it had any name but the one the Cherokee gave it. The rivers still run their ancient courses through the dark. The old seams still lie in the rock where ancient hands once followed them down. And the people who hold the deepest memory of all of it are still here, still on this land, still keeping what they know, still deciding rightly what is theirs to keep. The mountain is not empty. It was never empty. And neither, when you really let yourself think about it, lying there in the dark, is the ground beneath wherever you happen to be tonight. Every landscape on this whole earth was known and walked and named and understood by someone, long, long before the maps we use today were ever drawn. There is no empty land. There never was. We are, all of us, in every corner of the turning world, sleeping tonight on top of stories far older than any country, on ground that remembers feet that walked it before the memory of the oldest person's oldest ancestor. So rest now. You followed a long and winding question down into the dark tonight, and you stayed with it the whole way, all the way to the bottom, and that is a rarer and finer thing than you might think. Most questions like this one get a shrug and a click, and are gone. You gave this one your whole quiet night. So if this slow walk beneath the mountains was worth taking, you can tap the like button, gently, just once, as a small soft signal that you would like more nights like this one. Nothing more than that. A single light, left on in a window so I know to keep going. And if you would like to keep wandering with me through the hidden, buried, half-forgotten histories of the world we actually live in, the real ones, the honest ones, the ones that turn out again and again to be far stranger and far more beautiful than anything anyone needed to invent, then you can subscribe, and I will keep finding them, patiently, and bringing them to you here, in the dark, on nights like this. And if you feel moved, leave a comment before you drift off. Tell me again where in the world you're listening from, and what the land outside your window is like tonight. Mountains, maybe, or flat open country or desert, or the restless glow of a city that never fully sleeps. Because every one of those places, every single kind of ground, carries the very same deep memory. Every landscape was someone's home, and someone's knowledge, and someone's sacred and ordinary world, long before this particular night. And all of us, scattered across our different corners of the same slowly turning planet, drifting off at our own different hours, make a quiet kind of network of our own, just by being here together in the dark. Not so very different, when you think about it, from the old trade routes that crossed these very mountains thousands of years ago, carrying light and copper and stories from one distant patient hand to the next, across distances no single person could ever walk, holding a whole continent together in the dark. Let the questions rest now. They will keep. They are good at keeping. The shining seams still threading the rock. The copper that may, in some small unaccountable part, still be missing in the cold north. The undying town beneath the mountain itself breathing its soft blue breath up into the coming dawn, exactly as it did for the people who first stood where you stood at the beginning of tonight and gave this place its name. The ground beneath you is older than any country ever built on top of it, and it is fuller and deeper and far more honest in its bones than any story that ever tried to call it empty. Sleep well, The mountains are still out there, holding what they know, with a patience that will outlast every one of us, and the people who remember, and the night, and the slow blue breath of the forest rising in the dark. And now, perhaps, you carry a little of it too. Good night.